So the Dhandho investor, the book that came out a few years back, uh, Buffett has a quote. He says, "I'm a better investor because I'm a businessman, and I'm a better businessman because I'm an investor." And in essence, that book, The Dhandho Investor, is the expansion of that one sentence into 100 plus pages. Basically, kind of delving into that particular nuance. And the word Dhandho is a Gujarati word. And do we have any Gujaratis in the room? Oh, we have one Gujarati. All right, that's good. So people always think I'm from Gujarat in India because I wrote a book called The Dhandho Investor, and I have to always correct them and say I'm not Gujarati. I had a roommate from Gujarat, and he when I was doing my undergraduate in engineering, and he was also an engineering major. He used to disappear on weekends because all his family, extended family, had all these motels and laundromats and gas stations and whatnot that they owned in the Carolinas. And then he'd come back on Sunday night and he'd be bursting with all these stories about the new investments his family had made and all the kind of the economics of those investments. And then in the end, he would finish and say, "Mohnish, Dhandho." And that was his way of saying that the literal translation of the word Dhandho means business. But the way the Gujaratis use it, what it means is it's a way of doing business where you basically have upside with almost a non-existent downside. And which is the key to investing is, like Buffett says, rule number one, don't lose money. And rule number two, don't forget rule number one. And so that was kind of the backdrop behind the title and the book. And Indians make up about 1% of the population of the United States, a little over 3 million people. And the Patels, who are from Gujarat, are a much smaller portion of that 3 million. My guess is there will probably be less than 1/5 of 1% of the US population, well under 500,000 or so. And even though they're that small a portion, probably more than 60% of the motels in this country are under Patel ownership. And that's a stunning statistic, considering that 40 years back, there were no Patels over here. So they went from basically a standing start to pretty much dominating this industry, and they've moved up market. So they used to be at the lowest end, the smallest 10, 20, 30 room type highway motels, and now they're buying the Marriotts and the Westons and the Hiltons and all of that. So they're kind of moving up the chain, and they came to the United States as refugees, and most of them came from East Africa, from Uganda. And at that time, in the early 70s, there was this dictator, Idi Amin, who came into power in Uganda. And the Patels actually had come to Uganda several decades, more than 100 years before that. And they came mostly as indentured laborers. But over time, using their Dhandho techniques, they pretty much controlled large portions of the Ugandan economy. And Idi Amin was very pissed off about that. And his perspective was that Africa is for Africans. And so what he did is he pretty much nationalized all their assets and took over all their personal property and threw them out of the country. And so they were stateless, actually. They really had no state to go to. India was reeling from the Bangladesh war and all the refugees coming from Bangladesh. So India actually refused to take the Patels in as refugees. England took some. In the United States, at that time, the Nixon administration, they were quite familiar with the issue, and they were sympathetic to the plight of the Patels, but they were limited. So they took in, the United States took in a few thousand Patels, a few more thousand came to Canada. And most of these Patels who showed up in the US in the early 70s didn't have that much in the way of education. And the only money they could really carry with themselves was kind of whatever they could convert into gold quickly, a few $1,000s. And so they landed up in the United States, and they really found that they had virtually no skills which were of use to most employers. They had a heavy accent and really didn't have much in terms of skills. And but they found that motels, buying motels was a great way to go. And the reason they thought that was that because a typical Patel family at the time could buy a 10 or 15 room motel for well under 100,000, maybe $50,000 to $75,000, and the family could live in one or two of those rooms. And because motels are labor intensive, they would pretty much fire all the staff, and the family would do all the work. So laundry, cleaning rooms, watching the front desk, everything was done by different members of the family. And they became low-cost operators. They looked at every single facet of the business. And so once a motel came under Patel ownership, two things happened. One is that their operating costs dropped. And because the operating costs were lower, they were able to charge lower rates and increase occupancy. And so typically the Patel-owned motel in a particular area would always do economically better in terms of cash flows than the other non-Patel-owned motels. And as soon as they had enough cash flow, they would buy the second motel and then the third motel, and they just keep levering them and buying them up. And we end up with the result where we are today, where they pretty much dominate the space. And that aspect to the way they went about doing their business has a lot of correlation with investing, because the whole Buffett sentence of being a good businessman is a great skill set to being a great investor. And the particular facet that they followed was this notion that I call heads I win and tails I don't lose much. So if you looked at the economics of a Patel buying a motel, typically, they would put $5,000 or $10,000 down, and most of it was a bank loan. And if for some reason they were not able to manage the cash flows, the banks really would prefer not to take the motel back for closing it. They would prefer to do, what they did recently in the financial crisis: extend and pretend. Keep the same guy running it, and hope that things kind of improve. So either way, the end result was the Patels, even with high leverage, were unlikely to lose their properties, and they didn't. Because they were smart operators, they got nowhere near that mark. And after a few years, banks actually wanted to lend to motels under Patel ownership, because they saw the default rates and all that were markedly different than the rest of the population. And so that worked out quite well for them. And there's this notion that it's just the Patels that have this kind of tight-fisted way of operating.